Wow, packed room. Welcome. I think we'll kick off. My name is Alex. I used to be a developer, and now Claude writes all my code. This talk is supposed to be 10 tips to level up your AI-assisted coding, but it's very difficult to boil it down to 10, so there's going to be probably a few more than 10. It's a packed presentation, so I'll keep it very short. As I said, I'm Alex. I have a background in computer science, in machine learning and pattern recognition, and I wrote code for many years. And then I had 10 years where I did not write code, and I ran a fairly large company. I worked with building solutions, but I had a lot of people that wrote the code. And I think it was a bit of an advantage for me when I got back into coding, and I didn't have sort of my set ways of doing things. And I came back in the early days of GPT, where we had sort of sophisticated autocomplete, tab completions, and I've been along for the ride ever since. Today, I run a small company called Grit AI. We help a lot of organizations with AI. And last year I did the AI training for the National Oil Fund and the Norwegian Bank and a lot of other companies. I work with a lot of developers, but I also work with non-developers and non-technical people. And the greatest thing about generative AI, in my view, is that we are democratizing the ability to solve problems, and I really love it. So how many of you still write code? Yeah, fair enough. Those of you who still write code, do you use AI? Good. And how many of you have used Claude Code? So a bit of a disclaimer, that's a lot. I'm happy to see that. Bit of a disclaimer, I am the Anthropic ambassador in Norway. I run the Claude Code meetup in Norway. I'm not paid by Anthropic. They support the meetup, and I have access to them, so they tell me a lot of interesting things, which I really enjoy, and I try to share as much as possible. So this talk is going to be not specific to Claude Code, but I might say Claude a lot, but when I say it, it roughly translates to any AI coding agent or harness. So it's sort of, you can take my lessons and apply them, generally all of them. There are a few things at the end of the presentation which might still be specific to Claude Code, but yeah, try to just translate whenever I say the word Claude, okay? So I think for me personally, I haven't written a single line of code since probably August last year. And I think the big shift sort of came in October last year when we got the latest Opus model. And then I think a lot has obviously transpired since then. In the past 12 months, Anthropic, I believe, has dropped 9 frontier models in 12 months, including the one we got yesterday. And it just shows that the pace is incredible. Some of these are, of course, incremental improvements to capabilities. And I haven't had the chance. I didn't stay up all night last night. I did stay up a little bit. So I haven't really tried to sort of fully see the capabilities. But judging by benchmarks, which you always have to obviously take with a grain of salt, it appears to be a significant leap. And on the hardest benchmarks, I think that's maybe the most interesting thing, where you look at this fairly new benchmark, because all other benchmarks started to become obsolete. This one is called the Diamond Frontier Code benchmark, where the previous state of the art, was launched 2 weeks ago. So, and that was also from Anthropic. But if you compare it to GPT 5.5, you see it's not named here, but 5.5 is roughly where we see the black line. Sorry, the black line. And it's a significant leap. This one also shows cost, so obviously the cost has increased, but looking at what we've seen over the past year, we are expecting the costs obviously to also align after an initial period. But it is such a significant leap, and I think everything that I have in my slides, I had to go through again and review again in light of the new model capabilities. So I've tried my best to make it updated. Choose your own favorites. Try to apply what I'm saying to your tools. Some of you are, of course, constrained by your employers. I'm sorry for you, but you know, that's how it is. But of course, we need to keep giving arguments. To be honest with you, and this is maybe a bit controversial, but I think over time these models don't show sign of plateauing yet. At some point, you know, they will probably plateau. But right now there is no evidence that they will plateau in the short to medium term. And I believe that the need for harnesses will sort of become less and less. So over time, maybe it doesn't really matter what harness we use. But today, it does matter. I'm going to kick off with 10 tips, but the first tip is tip 0, and that is essentially, if you're new, I mean, a lot of you still write your own code, maybe supported by AI, hopefully supported by AI, and some of you have converted and sort of stopped writing code. Either way, I believe the most important thing is to approach this with a pair programming mindset. And I think we have a choice as developers and non-developers that we can use AI in a lazy way and essentially just throw a prompt at it and accept whatever comes out. And I think if we do that, we risk maybe becoming more stupid over time. But if we choose to actively collaborate with the AI, I think we can become even better versions of ourselves and not just become passive sort of takers of AI. But that is a choice, and you need to make that choice. I'm a big fan of something called compound engineering. How many of you have heard about compound engineering? Not many. It's a fairly new thing. I believe it was coined by a company called Every last fall. And the concept is very simple. I want my AI to learn as we work together. I want it to improve. Every rabbit hole we go down, every mistake that it makes, I never want to spend time on that mistake ever again. That is my ambition. Every time it's going to be smarter and smarter and smarter together with me, guided by me. In Norwegian, rentes effect, compounding. And this is definitely possible to achieve today, and I believe it's going to be even more achievable as the models grow stronger. So I'll talk about that in my tips. Another sort of tip 0 that I want to share, which is fairly simple. The guy on the screen here is, many of you probably know him. This is Boris, the creator of Claude Code. I had the pleasure of talking with him a few times. This was actually at the meetup that we host here in Oslo. And every time I ask him a question like, when do you think it's going to be possible to do this? Or when do you think we can do that? He sort of always sort of like just said, yeah, well, you can just ask Claude to do that. It can do that. And I was like, okay. And then I started actually thinking about it. And it's true. You can actually ask Claude, and we need to start practicing asking Claude or your favorite AI. Because I think as adults, we have this very fixed view on what is possible and what is not possible. It's something that is ingrained, and it's something that we are used to not changing very frequently. And we can learn from our kids, because they'll say, well, why can't we just do that? So what was not possible just a few months ago might just be possible now. And I think we need to keep recalibrating the definition of what is possible. So we should ask Claude. I even put it on the back of my hair so that you can actually see, just ask Claude. So every time, the simple answer is just ask Claude. Keep that in mind when I go through the tips. I believe it's more about mindset when we are changing the way we work with these tools than it is really about technology. Of course, it's enabled by technology, but I think it's really about applying our hard-earned lessons as developers and rethinking how we actually work together with AI. So here are my 10 tips. I'm going to go through them. Maybe they're not exactly tips. They're maybe categories of tips. So I've just crammed a lot of things into each of these categories. So buckle up, fasten your seatbelts. I'm going to go through this very rapidly, and I'll try to give you as much as possible in the time that we have left. First and foremost, most importantly, context is king. And I think this is the single most important thing we control, and that influences the output of whatever the AI is doing. Not just for development, for any use of AI. And context is not only critical, but it's also a scarce resource. It's something that we need to treat with care, and essentially our job is to try to optimize the highest impact tokens that we provide to the AI. And I think it's important for everyone to know and be aware that the context window is a finite of a finite size. So essentially, I like to talk about it as a glass, and every time we start a new session, certain things gets filled into the glass. The system prompt, the agents MD or the Claude MD file, any tool definitions, like our MCP servers, the name and the description of the tools, our skills, not the entire skill, but the name and the description of each skill. All of this adds into the glass. And then, of course, our conversation, our input to Claude or your agent, and the output, including any tool calls and all the thinking processes. And it adds up. The glass has been pretty stable now for the past sort of year and a half at around 200,000 tokens. And then a few months ago, we started seeing the introduction of 1 million tokens in window size. That's a pretty significant increase compared to 200,000. But irregardless of the size of the glass, what we have seen is that the results, they start to deteriorate when we approach somewhere around 70-80% of the glass. That means that we want to avoid filling the glass. But because what happens when we fill the glass, all new harnesses will auto-compact the content of our glass. So they will sort of gracefully allow us to keep going. But we generally don't want that to happen. And we've seen that if we approach full glass, the result starts to deteriorate. So the key tip for you is to keep an eye on your context. Manage your context. Use the tools you have available. Make it something that you control rather than leaving it up to the harnesses. If you use Claude Code, you can type in /status line, and you can essentially spell out, show me my context window as a battery indicator, visually, in green, or whatever you want. So just ask Claude, right? If you're using something like Cursor, you can also turn on or change the default behavior where you actually always see context. You can see the usage summaries. And if you're wondering what's eating up your context window, or where you're actually filling up the glass, type /context. It's something that you don't have to do all the time, but keep an eye on that window and pay attention to what you put in the context window. Those of you who attended the talk prior to this with Mats, he mentioned also that if you really want to preserve context and avoid certain things entering into inference or the LLM, you can lean towards CLI tools or functions and allow a programmatic, essentially deterministic behavior outside of inference. Claude doesn't have to necessarily look at all the data in a database. You can probably process the information and then extract that with code and hand it to your favorite AI. So be precious, or treat context as something precious and keep an eye on it, I think is the most important part. If you do have to auto-compact, well, then you should guide the auto-compaction. So use /compact and then provide specific instructions. Forget about all of our debugging, but remember everything else, right? You can guide the compaction. My favorite approach is actually to, I have a couple of skills, and I've essentially said that I say, let's continue later. And then Claude will automatically summarize the session, put it in a markdown file, and then I do /reset or /clear, and then I start a new session, and I just say continue work. And it will pick up the file, and it will continue from where we left off. either way, manage your context. Use rules. Rules is the first place where we can essentially guide and compensate for model behavior. And actually, whether or not you use Claude or other harnesses, you can put your rules in the agentsmd file or in the ClaudeMD file. If you're using Claude and you want sort of both or different tools to work, you can just say @agentsmd. Or the other way around. You can have an agentsmd file and you just say @claude.md. And either harness will pick up the same rules. So that's a little hack that we can use. Remember that the ClaudeMD file always enters the glass every time we start a new conversation. The tool definitions always enter the glass every time we start a new conversation or reset our context window. But skills, they enter the window the first time we start a session. But if we do /compact or we let it auto-compact, the skill definitions do not re-enter the context window. Only the ones that have been invoked during the session. That's something that trips a lot of people up, so just be aware if you let it compact. Treat rules and also the concept of memory as something that is not a one-off thing. You need to manage your rules, you need to manage your memory. And over time, you need to make sure that your ClaudeMD or your agentsmd does not grow out of proportions, right? The problem with filling the context window and why we see deteriorating results is essentially that we end up with confusing information, and then eventually the agent will start forgetting or ignoring certain parts. If some of our rules are critical and they get mixed up with too much information, we don't want that. Memory is, of course, an emerging concept in all harnesses. In its simplest form, it's essentially a way for us to persist state between sessions in a text file, typically a markdown file. In Claude, we have a file called memory.md. It lives alongside of ClaudeMD, but it lives in our global settings or in our global folder, but you can also have project-specific memory. It's a bit of a hidden thing, but you can always say, what do you know about me? Or use /memory, and you can actually edit the memory yourself. And you can also just prompt Claude and say, forget this, or remember this, right? Make sure that we remember this for the future, and it will add it to memory. But actively manage it and prune the rule files. Okay, I asked ChatGPT to help me visualize this thing. So the way I think about rules, but also in general, everything we put in place around our models in harnesses is essentially scaffolding, right? And why do we need it? Well, it's sort of to hold the model up so that it doesn't fall over, and it's to compensate for the inabilities that these models have. What do we put in our ClaudeMD file? Do this, don't do that, etc. Right? The simplest form of scaffolding is our ClaudeMD or agentsmd file. But what I think a lot of people do wrong is that you invest in your ClaudeMD or your agentsmd, and then we get a new model, and we're so happy with our ClaudeMD or our agentsmd that we just keep it and we keep building on it. And today, of all days, after what happened and what came out yesterday, I just want you to think about this and have a view on this, because what happens is that the scaffolding we put in place risk holding back the models. This was ChatGPT's way of showcasing that. So essentially, my recommendation to all of you is actually go home today and either just remove your ClaudeMD and give it some tasks and see how it performs. But at the very least, I know because most people won't do that. They're like, no, it's precious and I need to. Then you at least point Claude to it and say, you now have superpowers. What would you change here? What could hold you back? What should we remove? Just ask Claude, right? And this is something we should do every time we get a new model, because the capabilities are essentially exponentially growing right now. And we might actually be holding them back because we have been too specific in our rules. Do this, this, this in this sequence. Maybe the model now can do it in a completely different way, in a new way. So throw it out and start fresh. Skills. People ask me, what's the number one thing we should invest in 2026? What should I learn? How many of you use skills? Those of you who didn't raise your hand, you have one job. Start using skills. Skills is portable. It's something that the entire industry is one of those rare moments in our world where someone comes up with a stupid, simple, yet brilliant idea, and then the rest says, that's actually stupid, simple, and brilliant. We're all going to support it. So if you invest in skills, right now maybe Claude Code is the best harness, but maybe in 2 months there's a different harness. No problem. You can migrate and plug and play skills. Your rules, you can migrate and plug and play. Just make sure that they are adapted to the model. Skills is very simply a text file, markdown file, a folder with a skill.md file. That's the bare minimum skill. And essentially, I think of skills as 2 main categories. One, a way for us to teach the AI our preferences, our taste, our workflows, our ways of working, whatever it is. And the second category is a way for us to equip AI with new capabilities, capabilities that they may not inherently have. For instance, Claude is not able to create images. Well, it can create SVGs and do a lot of crazy things, but it's not an image model. Similarly, it cannot produce audio unless it builds a solution to produce audio, which it can now. But we can equip it with a skill and essentially teach it that it can use the Nano Banana API. And now all of a sudden, Claude can produce images. Or we can give it a skill that teaches it how to use the 11 Labs API. And then all of a sudden, it can create your own podcast episode if you want to. So skills for our preferences and tastes and workflows or new capabilities, essentially. And of course, as developers, we can also use some of the more advanced features in skills, which is essentially that we can bundle up in our skill templates, references. We can use hierarchies to essentially manage the context of skills as well. And maybe most importantly, we can enforce deterministic behavior from what is inherently a non-deterministic thing, LLMs, by using scripts. And essentially ensuring that every time we do something, it's done this exact way, which is actually incredibly powerful. For those of you who are new to skills, you can also say that this skill cannot be automatically invoked by the model. So I want to be in control, and only the user can invoke it. Then you just add the flag disable model invocation true to the front matter, the top of the skill file. If you want it to not be a slash command and only let the model invoke it, well, then you just put user invocable false. For some reason, they have this reverse logic in how they create their settings. Go build skills. Don't write skills yourselves. Use AI. Ask Claude. The best way to create a skill is to do a meaningful piece of work. So give feedback, ask your agent to do something, give feedback, and get it to the point where you're happy. And then, instead of celebrating, you say, now let's turn this into a repeatable skill. My rule of thumb is, if I do something more than once, it probably deserves to become a skill. Check your skills in, share it with the team when that's relevant, and the same with the Claude MD file. In your repository, it should be shared knowledge, and then you can still have your own personal preferences in your local Claude MD or your global Claude MD, or agents MD. Essentially now, skills is the same as slash commands. It's a bit confusing because slash commands existed long before we had skills. But you can chain skills together. You can have your skills reference other skills. You can have skills accept arguments. So essentially, you can do everything we previously could do with slash commands as well. And if you don't know the syntax or you don't know everything that you can do, just ask Claude, right? You just ask Claude and say, hey, let's make sure that this skill is not invoked by the model. It's only, okay, then it will do it for you. One last advanced tip is that with skills and sub-agents as well, we can actually do something called dynamic context injection by using an exclamation mark in the skill and a bash command. And what happens then is that we actually do a pre-process step where it runs the command, and it takes the output of the command, and it injects it in. So we do something outside of inference, and it becomes part of the context of the skill. It's a very clever thing, which we can, of course, use to our advantage for a lot of things, such as the example you see on screen. Yeah, as I mentioned, we can combine them. Use the skill creator skill when you build skills. Don't write skills yourselves. Don't go and download 1,000 skills from skills.sh. There's a lot of bad skills out there, so there's also a lot of attack vectors. So my recommendation is the best skills are the ones you build yourself together with your AI. Feel free to go online and find interesting skills, but then just go to your AI and say, hey, let's build this skill for us. Draw inspiration from this skill, right? Then you are more safe. Skill creator, it's an open source skill that Anthropic has. ChatGPT has a built-in one as well. My honest take, even though I'm of course a fanboy of Claude, is actually that the Claude skill creator is incredibly powerful because they introduced evals in the skill creator, which means that if you use that, it will actually build an eval suite if you ask it to, and it will test, and it will show you, and it will improve. So it's got a built-in self-improvement loop. And then you can take any skill, and you can do / skill creator, and say, let's improve this skill, and you point to your skill. You should try it out. It's really, really powerful. Always start with a plan. This has been a tip that I've been using for a long time. And I would say that more importantly than ever, this is where we should invest our time. As we write less and less code ourselves, and we sort of start gaining trust in the output of the models, we should invest more and more time in describing specifically what we want. That doesn't mean that we have to sit and write very, very long specifications. Of course, we can collaborate with AI to achieve this. Plan mode changed the whole mindset around AI-assisted coding when that was introduced in many of the solutions. Claude Code, eventually Cursor got it as well. Now all of them have some form of plan mode. Plan mode is also a safe mode, which means that it has read-only access, so you can not only use it to create plans, but you can also use it to safely explore your code base. If you want to do investigations, if you want to learn, you can just enter plan mode and then give it a prompt that is not just about creating a plan. So I would definitely recommend doing that. I tend to want to persist that plan. Again, back to managing context. In the past, I had to actively say, put it in a markdown file. Now it started to do a temporary markdown file, but I don't trust that. So I sort of still have ways where I want to persist it. Why do I do that? Well, one is that I want it to survive between session refreshes or where I clear the context window. But secondly, it's the #1 step to getting the AI to verify its own work instead of me having to verify the work. Because now, after it's built whatever it's built, or fixed whatever it's fixed, it can always measure it up against whatever we said we would build in the plan, right? So keep it, and then use it in the later stages. I use a progress document as well, which is not necessarily just a plan, but essentially to manage context between sessions. There's a lot of frameworks. There's been a lot of trends where, last year everyone was talking about spec and spec kit, and to be honest with you, choose whatever you want, right? The point is you need some sort of way to structurally describe what you want and give it the ability to use that afterwards to check if it's done what it was supposed to be doing. So yeah, frameworks are great. But keep it simple. The models are so smart now that they'll be able to figure out a great way to document. They'll be figuring out a great way to actually test against it afterwards. So have a little faith in the models now. They're just getting better and better, right? I think one key thing that I think is important for us to remember is that all the tools that we use today, all the processes that we have, they were put in place in a world where we didn't have these tools. And they were put in place because writing code was an expensive and scarce resource. So we tried to optimize around the fact that writing code was the bottleneck. I mean, you can disagree with me, but that's at least my view. And now, as we are starting to move in a direction where maybe writing code is becoming something that we can trust the AI to do equally good and maybe sometimes even better than us, then we're essentially saying that the bottleneck is no longer the bottleneck. So what happens is, my experience at least, is that the bottleneck actually starts shifting outwards. Not just in one direction, but in both directions. So now I've become the bottleneck. My AI can work in parallel. It can do so many things that I'm now struggling with keeping up, with feeding it enough jobs to be done. Describing what I want, sharing my intent, sharing my taste. That's becoming the bottleneck, the human bottleneck. On the other end of it, of course, checking, testing, verifying, validating is becoming a bottleneck. And it has been a bottleneck for a bit of a time now, I would say. So we're shifting the bottlenecks to new bottlenecks. But we still have the same tools and the processes as we had when the bottleneck was writing code. So my recommendation to everyone, or challenge to everyone, is to also challenge the tools, to challenge the processes that we have, to rethink. And we have now a very, very powerful model. Maybe throw the problem at that model and say, how should we in our team think about this? We have always been working this way. But now, as we start to trust AI to do the code writing, how should we rethink the tools and the processes around it? Why do we do code reviews the way we've done code reviews? Why do we do sprint planning the way we do sprint planning? Do we need retrospectives, or should we rethink how we do them? And then the tools we have available to do our job, do we need them in the same way, or do we need new tools? So I've been using the word chasing bottlenecks. Of course, this one is about coding, but honestly, I also want you to go back to wherever you work and bring the concept to them, because this applies to any knowledge work, in my opinion. It's not just about coding. We are just at the forefront. We're maybe where we're seeing it happening first. Eventually, we'll see this in many different jobs, right, and roles. And they have tools and processes that are also going to be outdated in a new world where the bottlenecks are moving. All right. That was my little philosophical share with you. I'll carry on. So why did I say that? Well, because I think if the bottleneck moves, it's more important than ever that we are actively engaged in these human bottlenecks. And essentially, on both sides of this, for instance, plan, right? How do we scope something? AI loves Markdown. And over time, it becomes challenging for me to stay engaged in a very long Markdown plan. So I sort of end up converging towards, yeah, that looks good. Let's just go on and continue, right? And that's very, very dangerous. Because then we are now sort of all hands off, and we are sort of approaching this lazy way of working, right? I'm afraid of that. And one way to stay in the loop and make it more interesting is something that's become a bit of a trend online recently, and probably you've seen that, and that is essentially just simply to say to your AI, instead of giving me this Markdown file, can you provide it to me in a visually appealing or interactive or engaging HTML file? And HTML is incredible, and of course you can then give it, styles, and you just turn it into a skill, so you never have to say that ever again. And now all of a sudden you can actually digest and have an engaging sort of feedback loop with the AI, instead of just saying, yeah, that looks good. I guess some of you have done that before. At least I have. So definitely use other formats than just text if you want to stay in the loop. Oh, sorry. Yeah. The other end of it as well, I think, is to look at the whole chain. And one of my favorite plugins or a set of skills is something called superpowers. How many of you have used superpowers? Okay, well, those of you who did not raise your hand, you can take a picture and you can go home and try this, because this is going to blow your mind, I would say. Superpowers is essentially a collection of skills that tries to sort of address all the steps in a development process. But it can also be used for other things than development. One fair warning is that if you sort of run the whole process, all steps, it's a very token-intensive process. And it can definitely be overkill for certain tasks. So here again is where I would take the skill, and then I will ask Claude to modify the skill for me and say, let's not make the whole process model invocable, and then let me be in control. Because then you can choose to invoke the whole process if you want to, but it doesn't happen for small things where it shouldn't use it. You can check it out. There are several steps, but I want to bring out one very important thing, and that is essentially the brainstorming skill. Brainstorming skill is essentially plan mode on steroids. And what was really, really cool, a couple of months ago, they made an update to it, and then all of a sudden, Claude said to me, this might actually be easier to show to you. Do you mind if I spin up a web server and get your input? And I was like, what? Of course, yes, please do that. And now, the brainstorming skill does that. So it's not just about showing you the signs. It say, do you want to go in this direction or you want to go in this direction? But it can also show you architecture choices, just in a visual way. So this is sort of an automation of asking it to show me this plan in a markdown file, but with user input. Because it will show you, do you want to do option 1, 2, or 3? And you can click, and it actually sends the feedback back to Claude. So I would highly recommend you try this out. Of course, you can port that skill to your favorite coding agent. The last part of sort of this bottleneck chasing is, of course, then how do we keep up with reviewing and checking and verifying that something is actually done? And I think the mindset should be like this. What tools do you use to do your job? And if you expect your coding agent to do that job for you, or at least parts of that job, that coding agent needs the same tools and the same context that you use. A very cool exercise is actually to, if you're using Claude Code or something, try to start a day in the terminal, and then every time you have to leave the terminal to do your job, apart from drinking coffee, then write it down. You have to go check Slack. You have to go, look up something online, or you have to go check something in Jira or something. All of these are signals of tools you should probably consider giving to your coding agent. Right? So it's a good exercise to just figure out what tools does my AI need. The smart people, I'm not one of those, but the smart people, they've also said this, right? Maybe the single highest leverage that we can do right now is to give AI a way to verify its own work. Because I don't want my AI to say, I'm done, and then I have to go spin up the dev server, open up Chrome, test it, go through all of these flows, and then only to figure out some error message deep down in the console or whatever. I just want the AI to do that for me. So I have to give it the tools, and I have to give it a way to verify the output. And of course, we have to, tell it what done looks like, right? So you can, of course, now, with many different MCPs or plugins, like the Chrome plugin, or you have built-in browsers, like in Cursor, Claude Desktop App, Codex. So we already have the means to give it these abilities, right? In a controlled way, right? We can tell it what it can and can't do. We can opt in for permissions. And then you can actually just say, continue until you're done, right? This is a bit slow, right? It's not lightning fast to do this. But in my opinion, that doesn't matter. That can just keep running over there, and I can keep working over here. That's fine. Another way to give feedback, have any of you heard about this thing called agentation? None. Okay, well, you're getting a lot of value here today, I think, because this one is actually also a very simple thing where we can inject essentially a little toolbar on top of our, in this case, Next.js application, and it allows us to run locally, but we can now provide feedback while we're using the application. We can draw, we can click, it will capture the DOM paths, so it has the context, right? And it's actually brilliant. Now they have a similar functionality in the Claude desktop app. If you use that, I mean, I use the terminal, but for front end, I go over to the Claude desktop app, because there we also have DOM-specific annotation. And the great thing is, we just click and we draw and we describe, and then we, in this case, just click copy prompt and we paste it back into our coding agent, or in the Claude desktop app, it automatically feeds it back into the agent. So addressing and chasing those bottlenecks, right? How can I give feedback faster? How can I give my agent ways to verify its own work? Yesterday we got Fable 5 and Mythos, for those who are lucky enough to be in certain industries. And Tarek is one of the developers on the Claude Code team. They made this post. We used to verify that Claude did the work right. Now we verify that it's doing the right work. And I think that's something we should obviously draw some inspiration from. And there are some mindsets that these people that are definitely working on the forefront are seeing before we're able to even grasp and think about this, right? So instead of us prompting, instead of us spending our time on verifying that it ended up doing it, they're sort of starting to get to the point where they're trusting that it can verify its own work, and they shift the focus to actually managing and ensuring that it's doing the right work, that it has the essentially the harness around it to guide and do work over time. So instead of us just deciding every single piece of work, we're essentially moving towards defining a goal or an outcome, something to be achieved, and then we put more trust in that the models are now more capable to actually do that without the what's it called? Støttehjul in Norwegian. I don't know. Support wheels? No, maybe. In both Codex and in training wheels, exactly. In both Codex and in Claude Code, we now have something called /goal. And /goal is essentially, very simply put, well, maybe an extension of the loop that we got introduced earlier this year. But essentially, what we say is, instead of giving a description of what to do, we're essentially telling it what we want to achieve. An outcome, objectives, and then we leave it up to our agent to figure out how to do it. And then that might sound like, oh, now we're sort of stepping away and not having any control. But that's not true, because our agent is, of course, bound by the tools that we equip it with and the skills that we give it. So our way to guide repeatedly is, of course, to invest in skills and invest in tools, right? And then gain the trust and let it run. And the way both of these implementations work is essentially a multi-agent approach, where we just say one important thing is that we don't let the same agent evaluate whether or not it's achieved the goal. And then everything else is just a loop. So every time it runs the loop, it says that I'm done, and then another agent verifies or checks. And if it disagrees, the loop starts again, and we keep going. Which is simple, but shows incredibly better results. But again, if you have a very, very ambitious goal, of course, this can be expensive. A lot of the tips that I give you are sort of assuming you're token rich. Okay, so speaking of which, I used to have the tip, use the right model. And then I changed it to use the best model. Now, maybe in a week I'll change it back, because I know this is going to be expensive after what we got yesterday. But honestly, I view it this way. The time that I have to spend fixing, correcting, guiding with a lesser model, or a mediocre model, or a sub-top model, I believe we can essentially defend the additional cost of running a superior model. And again, that's easy to say if you are privileged with the tokens. Of course, you need to think of it slightly differently if you are token poor. I also laugh when I see people online saying, well, this is not possible to do on the $20 plan. It's like, no. I'm sorry, you can't do this on the $20 plan. Then I would ask myself, what is my time worth? And if I can save time or be 10x the version of myself, I at least have no problem saying that I'll spend $1,000, or sorry, not $1,000, maybe sometime, but $100 or $200 every month. But it's each and every one to themselves, right? You can definitely do a lot to manage token use. If you are scratching your head and wondering what's consuming tokens and what can I do to achieve it, if you want to optimize, my single most important tip for you is to run /usage. They just added it to the SDK, which means I think we'll see it in the desktop app in days, because that was the limitation before. But in the terminal, do /usage, sorry, and then scroll down. Because below your sort of session data, they have recently, this is fairly new, given you a summary of what's consuming tokens. And then if you scroll even further down, you'll actually see explicit mentions of what skills and what they're consuming. And then often you'll find the culprit there. If you're sort of now seeing like, whoa, I don't understand. I've only used it a little bit and it's already spent my quota. /usage, go down, and you'll see that, oh, it's that superpowers plugin that Alex recommended, and it's burning all of my tokens. So yeah, you can optimize, definitely. Make use of subagents. Subagents is our way to essentially engineer infinite context windows. Because each subagent has their own context window. And last night, they also introduced nesting of subagents, which is like I need to wrap my head around what we can do with this, which means that we can essentially have subagents spin up additional subagents, and they put a cap for now 5 levels deep. But I mean, this is just insane. You can also fork context when you use subagents. This is a bit more advanced, but think of it like this. The main agent spinning up subagents, they will essentially start with an empty glass, and their input is just whatever the prompt from the main agent, right? But if we do have cases where we think they should have access to everything that we've worked on so far, we can essentially do a fork of the context simply by saying context :fork in the subagent definition. So that's a useful thing in some cases. But yeah, use subagents. You can definitely invest in sort of predefining subagents. To be quite honest with you, I've done that a lot, but now I've sort of started removing them because I see that the latest models now, essentially after Opus 4.8, are very capable of defining on the fly and figuring out what are the agents we need for the job. And again, this is another thing that may become a stale thing that is holding your model back, right? Because maybe you created a subagent last fall, and you were very specific about do this, do this, do this, do this, right? And then you just leave it there. And so yeah, maybe you should rethink your subagents. Definitely use subagents, but maybe don't invest too much time in all the specifics of each one. Time flies, but I still have some time. So next up, hooks. So again, around how do we control? So context, we can use subagents to essentially get more context in our processes. But we also do want to have a way to put in place guardrails. And hooks was invented for that purpose, allowing us to essentially stop the agent at certain events outside of inference and enable deterministic behavior. Because even though we can say, never, ever, ever do this in your Claude MD file, that is not a guardrail. We can pray and hope that it follows the instructions, and increasingly they do, but that is not guaranteed. So if you need guarantees, you need to use hooks. Hooks is essentially something that will be triggered on whatever events that we specify, These are probably some of the most common events, but then if you go into the documentation, there's a long list of growing a number of events available. For instance, we can use the pre-tool use hook or event to create a hook that essentially checks what is the agent trying to do. Is this something we want to disallow? And then we can put a hard stop on the agent and say, you're not allowed to do RM, for instance. We can enforce that. And that's the safe way of doing it. We recently also got an if clause, support for if clauses in hook definitions in Claude Code. Not yet in other agent harnesses, but I'm sure this will come in other harnesses as well. So use the event types combined with a matcher, for instance, and then put your logic in a script, and then you have a guardrail in place. Hooks can also be used for other things than guardrails. We can use it, for instance, to say something like every time before we do a commit, we want to do this and this, or every time a file has changed, we want to run a linter. We can do a lot of these things for productivity and workflows as well, where we enforce it. And then essentially something like, for instance, Ralph Wiggum, which was a popular thing earlier this year, is essentially achievable by just having a hook on the stop event where it says keep going. Right? That's essentially the simplest implementation of a Ralph Wiggum loop. I said in my introduction that I'm very passionate about compound engineering, and I would just very much urge you to have that mindset when you work with AI these days, to say all the time, keep in mind that you want it to learn from its mistakes. You want it to reflect on what you have done together. You can turn it into a skill or put it in a slash command. You can even put it in a hook if you want it to happen every time you do a slash clear or every time you end a session. So you can sort of automate this process. But the simple way is just to say, we finally fixed this. Now let's learn from our mistakes. I never ever want to go down in this rabbit hole ever again. Or you say, let's reflect on our session today. What mistakes did we make? What are the key learnings? Put it in a markdown file. Or even better, turn it into a skill so that it happens automatically next time. You can use this for patterns in your code base, and you can then turn those patterns into skills, for instance. How do we write tests? How do we essentially define our commit messages? I mean, you can do simple things, but you can do really powerful things as well. So just think about how you onboard and train your AI assistant. That's essentially the mindset you need to have. How many of you have ever used /insights? Okay, now honestly, this one? Okay, I'll stop for a second there. I'll stop on this one. /insights. All AI coding harnesses, they have a way to store and capture your sessions. Most people might not be aware. This is what enables us to do /resume, for instance, in Claude. But you can do this in any harness. They don't have /insights, but you can do the same thing with your favorite agent. And essentially what it does is it looks at the folder where all of the session information is stored. So essentially everything you've done together. And then the /insight is essentially just a skill, which says something like, analyze all of our sessions over the past 30 days and look for patterns, draw out key learnings. Where did we go wrong? Where did we fail? What did we do well? And then it puts it all together into an HTML report. So when you run that command, and if you don't have Claude Code, you can do the same thing just by saying that. Analyze our session data, extract, everything that we did bad or we could improve, and then give me suggestions. And that's what it does. It pats you on the back and says, yeah, you're a good boy, you did all of these great things. Great. But then it also shows you what you can improve. And it might actually also float things you were not aware you could do. Capabilities that are there that you might not be aware of. And in Claude's case, which you can also instruct your agent to do, is provide me with copy-pastable prompts or examples, right? And essentially what it does here is, here's things you can do in your Claude MD file. Here are hooks that you should consider introducing, which can avoid these mistakes that happened 25 times in the past 30 days. And it just, like, it blows my mind what you can learn from this. It only makes sense if you've used the harness for a little while, of course, and you have some sessions. And then you should just make a habit out of doing this regularly. I mean, this is compounding. This is like how you can actually improve so much if you just make use of it. And it's actually very simple. Learn from Claude Code and apply it to whatever agent you're using. So just have that mindset. We can definitely update our memory and rules, and we should do that. We should actively manage it. We should try to capture things and patterns into skills. If we want to enforce it, we can definitely use hooks to ensure that it happens all the time, and not leaving it up to hoping that the AI will do it. And then just have that mindset of continuously asking your AI to learn from its mistakes. You'll get so much better results from working with AI. I'm not going to spend time on this too much, but yeah, you should definitely equip your AI with the tools and the information it needs to do the job. And MCP is definitely a way for us to equip our AI with context and information, but also to give it ability to perform actions on our behalf. A lot of people say MCP is dead and CLI is, and I don't agree, but I do, as an individual contributor, developer, lean towards CLI tools when it's for me. Because coding agents are excellent at using bash commands, and they are very, very good at learning how to use CLI tools. So it's less context heavy in most cases. I would lean to CLI tools. But MCP still has a big place because this is how we can also distribute the capabilities to non-developers, to other platforms and solutions which may not be agentic coding harnesses. So yeah, give it the tools that it needs to do the job. And then lastly, or maybe not lastly, but tip number 9, try to work in parallel. If you start out and you start trusting the code production, the code writing, you are going to end up in a point where you're drinking coffee while you're waiting for your agents, and it's a limit to how many coffee cups we can drink. So you start thinking, how can I now give more agents more work to do, right? And this can be very addictive, and it can ruin marriages. I saved mine, but I would have to say I was a bit close when Claude Code launched remote control, because then I was sort of sitting, yeah, I'm listening to you, and I was always just trying to keep my agents busy. So maybe take a break once in a while. But you can start simply by obviously running multiple sessions. We have all the things we need, for instance, work trees, which allows us to have isolation, and we can do parallel work. We become the bottleneck in giving it tasks. You can hook your agents up to, for instance, GitHub. In my case, I use GitHub issues, and I've added Claude to my GitHub. And before I brush my teeth in the evening, I sort of just say, at Claude fix this, at Claude fix this, at Claude fix this. And then I see how many it can finish before I finish brushing my teeth. My record is 6, and I don't brush my teeth very long. But you can definitely do that. Remote control allows us to go out and touch grass and get some fresh air once in a while still keeping our agent busy when they need us. But 2 days ago, we got the internet cooking with a new concept, because these people, Peter Steinberger and Boris, posted, I've stopped prompting. My job now is writing loops where Claude prompts other Claudes. And the internet is like, what does it mean? Well, and then Addy from Google wrote an article and coined the sort of loop engineering. So I guess we've gone from less capable models with small context windows, and we invented prompt engineering because we wanted to optimize sort of the one-shot tasks. And then it evolved into context engineering as the context window grew larger and we could do multiple tasks. We also got tools like MCP. And then recently it sort of migrated into or evolved into what we call harness engineering, right? Which is really around putting these context engineering practices at scale, managing larger loops, longer running tasks, And then now, obviously, we need to start talking about loop engineering. But what is it really? I think it's really about using the constructs we now have available and the capabilities of the models to essentially, instead of prompting, we give it a stop condition, we give it a goal, we give it a target, and then we give it the means to work potentially at a large scale. Potentially hundreds, if not thousands of agents and a lot of tokens. But you can achieve incredible things. But don't let this sort of fool you. I think a lot of the problems we try to solve, we probably can solve in a much simpler. But in essence, today we have everything we need to create loops and work in loops. And I think the only thing we need to think about is we need a way for our agents to store state or persist tasks or to-do lists across sessions. Because then we can say every night, check if there's work to be done, and if so, do the work until it's done. And essentially, that's sort of the simplest way to talk about loop engineering. But feel free to dive into it. Claude made these slides, by the way. I'll give him feedback if you didn't like them. We have all the mechanisms. If you really want to burn tokens and see like incredible things, but still very, very expensive, you should try something called Ultra Code, which we got 2.5 weeks ago in Claude Code. And it's essentially a way to tell Claude to write its own harness on top of Claude Code. And it will essentially create a repeatable workflow, which could involve many, 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 many agents to solve very, very complex things. Definitely overkill for a lot of things, but very interesting for a lot of things. Remember to ask Claude, also ask it to build tools. And remember to mention to Claude that it is not a human. Remember to mention to Claude that it is Claude and that it can use Claude to solve problems. Because a lot of times if you ask an AI, it will think like a developer because it's trained on how we solve problems, and it will write a regexp for that problem. Instead, it could have just used Claude in headless mode or use the OpenAI API and actually send off and do a sentiment analysis or whatever, right? Just remind it, give it a nudge, and you'll see amazing solutions. Remember to be the human in the loop. My time is up, sorry about that. I tried to time it, but remember that we still need to check, but figure out how you can make it easier to check, to invest less time in these things. Yeah, and follow me on LinkedIn, add me on LinkedIn, and check out my YouTube channel if you want to. And I'll stick around for questions. Thank you very much.